The train stops a few meters from a packed earth ramp between two rows of barracks that disappear into the distance. The wagon doors are thrown open, and from inside comes a smell none of the new arrivals can fully identify. Sweat, urine, bodies that have spent several days without water. Sealed inside a space designed for livestock, SS guards shout orders in German that half the deportees cannot understand, pushing men, women, and children into two separate lines. A doctor wearing white gloves points with the slightest movement of a finger to the left or the right, spending no more than 3 or 4 seconds in front of each person. He does not ask for names. He does not examine documents. One glance at the age and physical condition of each body is enough for him to decide who will enter the camp to work that same afternoon and who will never see the sun again. Those who end up on the wrong side of the line are told they are going to take a shower. A sign written in several languages asks them to remain calm and orderly. They walk down a staircase into an underground room with columns and wooden benches where numbered hooks hang from the walls. A guard repeatedly tells them to remember their number so they can collect their clothes afterward. They undress without knowing that there will be no clothes left to collect. Still in line, they are made to enter a second adjoining room, smaller than the first, with false shower heads screwed into the ceiling that were never connected to any water pipes. The door closes with a gas-tight mechanism. Above them, at ground level outside, an officer wearing a gas mask opens a hatch in a wire mesh column and drops a handful of bluish pellets inside. The screaming lasts between 15 and 20 minutes. Then there is nothing left to hear. Once the air has been ventilated, men from the Sonderkommando enter to remove the bodies. They search mouths for gold dental work, cut the women's hair before rigor mortis sets in, and carry everything toward a freight elevator that connects directly to the furnace room 1 floor above. During the busiest days of 1944, that entire circuit train, ramp, selection, false shower room, sealed chamber, furnaces, is repeated dozens of times, with thousands of people entering and never coming out in the space of just 24 hours. None of this existed when the site was established 4 years earlier as a converted military barracks outside a Polish town. In April 1940, the place was nothing more than an abandoned and dilapidated artillery barracks of the Polish army on the outskirts of Auschwitz. The SS selected it for reasons that still had nothing to do with mass murder. It stood near a major railway junction connecting much of Central Europe, contained brick buildings that could be refurbished quickly, and was isolated enough to operate without unwelcome scrutiny. Heinrich Himmler ordered it converted into a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. The first 30 prisoners arrived from Sachsenhausen on May 20. 1,940 German common criminals who were assigned the first registration numbers and ordered to prepare the grounds for those who would come after them. Rudolf Höss arrived that same year, with a record the SS regarded as ideal. A veteran of the First World War, a member of paramilitary units since the 1920s, and a former officer at Dachau and deputy commandant at Sachsenhausen. He had seen at close range how a model concentration camp operated and brought with him the unwritten manual of SS discipline. Exhaustive record-keeping, rigid hierarchy, and forced labor as an instrument of control. What he found in Auschwitz were 20 single-story buildings, without adequate sewage, without enough running water, and with room for only a few thousand men. His first task was not to kill anyone, it was to build. To add a second floor to each barracks, lay water lines, and excavate foundations for new storage buildings. Höss relied on the only labor force available to him in sufficient numbers, the prisoners themselves. He forced them to work 14 or 16 hours a day on rations calculated to keep them alive only long enough to finish each construction project, and no longer. The logic he imposed from the first month was simple and would be repeated throughout the camp's existence. Every expansion of the infrastructure would be built by the very people condemned to die within it. The camp built itself with the blood of those who inhabited it. On the 1st of March 1941, Heinrich Himmler arrived in Auschwitz to inspect the progress in person. He did not come merely to examine barracks. He came with an industrial plan in mind. The chemical conglomerate IG Farben had set its sights on the region because of its access to coal, water, and forced labor, and was preparing to build a complex for the production of synthetic rubber and fuel barely a mile from the camp, in the village of Dwory. During that same visit, Himmler gave Höss 2 orders: expand Auschwitz DEF to hold 30,000 prisoners, and begin constructing a second, much larger camp 3 kilometers away near the village of Brzezinka. intended to house as many as 100,000 Soviet prisoners of war, expected to be captured during the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. That second camp would bear the German name of the village, Birkenau. No one yet spoke of exterminating the Jews of Europe. In March 1941, Auschwitz-Birkenau was conceived as an industrial-scale slave labor camp, designed to sustain the German war machine with bodies that would be consumed and replaced. But during the same month Himmler gave the order, the Eastern Front began creating a logistical problem the SS had not anticipated. The Wehrmacht advanced faster than expected. Soviet prisoners of war were captured by the hundreds of thousands, and there were not enough barracks, food, or guards to keep them alive. The solution the SS began testing at different points along the front and behind the lines was not to feed those prisoners more adequately. It was to kill them faster than they were being captured. This is where the second man who would shape the architecture of Auschwitz entered the story, Karl Bischoff, an SS officer trained in civil engineering who, in October 1941, took command of the newly created Auschwitz Central Construction Office. Bischoff did not initially design gas chambers. He designed drainage systems, internal road layouts, electrical networks, and field kitchens capable of feeding tens of thousands of people each day. Other officers trained in architecture and engineering worked beneath him, along with technically skilled prisoners whose knowledge the SS exploited without recognition or protection. Those prisoners drew many of the scale plans that survive today as evidence. One of them, a prisoner employed as a clerk inside the construction office itself, would testify years later that the office planned absolutely everything built within the complex: housing blocks, medical installations, and later crematoria and gas chambers. The order to enlarge Birkenau for 100,000 Soviet prisoners of war was never carried out as planned. Most of those prisoners died from hunger, cold, or disease before the barracks were completed, or were shot outright in nearby forests. The camp intended to house them alive instead became a laboratory for a different problem: how to eliminate masses of human beings without using ammunition, without exposing the killers to the psychological strain of shooting people face to face, and without leaving too much visible evidence. The experiment carried out on September 3 inches, the basement of Block 11, was not an isolated event in that search. It was the first documented test of a method the SS had already been seeking. Zyklon B did not arrive at Auschwitz as a weapon. It arrived as an ordinary commercial product, distributed by a subsidiary of IG Farben and packaged in sealed cans together with an irritating warning agent that, during its normal use as a fumigant, alerted people to its presence before the concentration became lethal. Since 1940, it had been used to disinfect barracks and clothing infested with lice, the carriers of typhus, the plague the SS feared more than any prisoner revolt. It was Karl Fritsch who, without explicit authorization from Berlin, independently decided to test it on human beings. In his later statements, Höss attributed the idea to his subordinate and claimed only to have approved the result once the experiment had already taken place. The detail matters. The first gas chamber in the history of the Nazi regime did not emerge from a master plan drawn up at a desk in Berlin, but from the improvisation of a mid-ranking officer trying to solve an escalating logistical problem with the materials available to him. Following that test, the construction office received instructions to adapt a room in the existing crematorium at Auschwitz I ILO, elongated building near Höss's own office, and convert it into a permanent gas chamber. The windows were sealed, the door was reinforced, and an opening was cut into the roof so the crystals could be poured in from outside without anyone having to enter. The space, originally intended as a mortuary, now served two functions: killing, and only a few meters away, incineration. The proximity of the two operations appeared to solve the problem that had concerned Höss since the first experiment: what to do with the bodies before they began to decompose and reveal through their smell what was happening behind the camp's closed doors. But the same building soon exposed its limitations. It stood within sight of administrative offices and of the homes where SS personnel lived with their families inside the complex. Józef Paczynski, a Polish political prisoner assigned as a barber to the officers, climbed more than once onto the roof of a nearby building, lifted a tile, and watched from above what took place in the crematorium courtyard. If one prisoner could see, anyone could see. Höss reached the same conclusion any manager would reach when an operation needed to expand without being detected. It had to be moved away from the offices, away from the homes, away from eyes that were not meant to watch. The timetable driving that expansion was not decided at Auschwitz. It was decided in a villa beside a lake near Berlin. On the 20th of January 1942, 15 officials from different branches of the Nazi apparatus met at Wannsee to coordinate on paper something that had already begun to be carried out in practice on several fronts. The systematic murder of every Jew in Europe, counted region by region and country by country, on a list that included territories Germany did not yet even control. Auschwitz was not mentioned as the principal site during that meeting, but the decision formalized there required, somewhere on the map, an extermination capacity no existing camp could yet provide. Birkenau, with its vast area, its proximity to the railway network, and its already demonstrated willingness to kill without public scandal, became the place capable of expanding that decision to an industrial scale. The decisive turn came on the 27th of February 1942, during another inspection, this time by Hans Kammler, Bischoff's direct superior within the SS construction hierarchy. Kammler decided that the crematorium already planned for Auschwitz I, with 5 ovens containing 3 muffles each, should not be built there but transferred in its entirety to the grounds of Birkenau. The decision appeared technical, almost bureaucratic, but it completely redefined the geography of extermination. It permanently removed the machinery of death from the offices and residences of Auschwitz I and concentrated it within a territory of almost 170 hectares, divided into sectors by electrified fencing, where barracks for tens of thousands of prisoners, an internal railway ramp, and now a complex of gas chambers and furnaces were being built simultaneously as a single production line. The solution came in the spring of 1942, and it did not involve constructing an entirely new building. It involved repurposing what already existed. On the outskirts of Birkenau stood 2 Polish farmhouses expropriated during the camp's construction. The SS sealed the windows of both houses, reinforced their doors, and converted them into primitive gas chambers. Camp personnel nicknamed them, with the cynicism repeated throughout Auschwitz's internal vocabulary, the Little Red House and the Little White House. They had no mechanical ventilation and no cremation system of their own. At first, the bodies were buried in mass graves dug nearby. Later, they were exhumed and burned in the open air because the pits could no longer contain the rate of decomposition or the volume of corpses, which was already exceeding every previous estimate. The first deported Jewish women arrived at Auschwitz on the 26th of March, 1942. At first, the transports did not bring people from all across Europe. They came mainly from Upper Silesia and Slovakia, nearby regions, as though the camp were still functioning as a test site before assuming the central role it would later play. Those judged fit for work entered the camp and received a number tattooed on the forearm. Those who were not the elderly, children, mothers with small children, the sick were taken directly to the Little Red House or Little White House without ever being told where they were going. The pace of the transport soon began to exceed the capacity of the 2 converted farmhouses. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be burned outdoors, and the smell and smoke became impossible to conceal from the surrounding population. Karl Bischoff then received the assignment that would permanently transform the scale of the complex. Design permanent facilities capable of killing and incinerating in a single, enclosed circuit, sustaining a rate of thousands of bodies per day for months or years, without depending on improvised graves or open-air pyres. On the 17th of July 1942, Heinrich Himmler returned to Auschwitz for the second time, no longer needing to imagine on paper what he had ordered set in motion a year and a half earlier. He toured the barracks, stopped at the unloading ramp during the selection of a newly arrived transport from the Netherlands, and personally watched, from a distance calculated by his escort, as a group of deportees entered Bunker 2 and never came out. That same night he held a long conversation with Höss. In the following days, he issued 2 orders that decisively accelerated the camp's expansion. He demanded that every body buried in mass graves during the previous months be exhumed and incinerated so that no future count could precisely establish how many people had already died there. He also ordered that the total capacity of the complex be raised to 200,000 prisoners. Höss, whose superior was satisfied with the outcome of the inspection, received a promotion weeks later. The industrial scale Bischoff began projecting on paper from that moment onward was not merely the product of an internal camp calculation. It answered a verbal order issued at the site itself by the man directing the entire SS apparatus, after he had witnessed with his own eyes that the method worked. Bischoff did not work alone on the design. He relied on a German civilian company based in Erfurt, Topf und Söhne, which until then had specialized in cremation ovens for municipal cemeteries. The company's engineer, Kurt Prüfer, had already supplied a simple cremation oven to the camp in 1940, intended for prisoners who died of natural causes within the enclosure. Now he received an assignment of a different kind: design furnaces capable of incinerating a volume of bodies far greater than any civilian crematorium, with multiple muffles in each unit and operating almost continuously. Prüfer did not ask exactly why that capacity was required. He prepared estimates, designed, invoiced, and in some cases even patented technical improvements to the furnace draft in order to optimize fuel consumption per corpse. The surviving commercial correspondence describes the work in the same neutral language the firm might have used when selling machinery to a textile factory. The plans produced by the construction office throughout 1942 reveal a logic of gradual expansion rather than a finished project conceived from the beginning. There are sketches for a disinfection building with a gas chamber that was never constructed. There's a plan dated November 1941 for a crematorium identified as 2 and 3, still intended at that point for Auschwitz I. There is also a drawing for a monumental administrative headquarters that was never built, evidence that even the SS leadership still did not fully understand, by the end of 1941, the dimensions the operation would eventually reach. Inside Topf und Söhne itself, professional rivalry pushed the design even further. Kurt Prüfer was not the only engineer who saw Auschwitz as a career opportunity. Fritz Sander, manager of the furnace construction division and Prüfer's rival within the same company, watched his colleague gain prestige with each new commission from the camp and decided to present an even more ambitious design of his own: a continuously operating furnace intended to incinerate bodies without interruption, using fat from the corpses themselves to reduce the consumption of outside fuel. Sander filed the patent on the 26th of October 1942, corrected it, and submitted it again days later. In a letter to the owners of the company dated September 14 of that year, he requested urgent legal protection for his invention, aware, in his own words, that other furnace manufacturers might be competing for the same type of contract. His design was never built exactly as he imagined it, but the patent application survived in the archives as evidence that, within a German engineering firm serving clients throughout the world, the efficient mass incineration of human beings had briefly become a field of commercial competition between office colleagues. Prüfer, for his part, visited Auschwitz at least 5 times between the beginning of 1943 and 1944, always for the same stated purpose: to supervise construction, correct draft failures in the chimneys, and adjust the forced ventilation system his own company installed inside the gas chambers, so the contaminated air could be removed after each use, and the waiting period shortened before the next group of Sonderkommando prisoners entered to remove the bodies. That ventilation system, as mundane in its technical description as any industrial extractor fan, allowed the gas chamber to avoid remaining unusable for hours after each killing, and therefore made it possible to carry out several murder cycles per day inside the same building. The undressing room preceding each gas chamber was designed specifically to maintain the calm of those about to die. Numbered wooden benches ran along the walls. The hooks were also numbered, with instructions translated into several languages telling each person to remember the number so they could recover their clothing after the supposed shower. At some stages of the process, guards or members of the Sonderkommando, acting under orders, distributed soap and towels before opening the door into the adjoining room. None of those details served any genuine hygienic purpose. They served a function of control, reducing panic, preventing physical resistance, and gaining the minutes necessary for several hundred people to enter in an orderly manner a space from which they would not emerge alive. The final design, brought into operation in stages between March 1943 and early 1944, was repeated with variations in 4 separate buildings numbered Crematoria 2, 3, Ifer, and V. The first 2 were the largest and most sophisticated in the entire complex. Each contained a long underground undressing room with columns and wooden benches, presented to the new arrivals as a shower area before admission to the camp. Beside it, connected by a narrow corridor, stood a second sealed underground room fitted with gas-tight doors and false shower heads on the ceiling that were never connected to water pipes. Above that room, at outside ground level, stood wire mesh columns through which SS personnel wearing gas masks introduced Zyklon B crystals without having to enter. A freight elevator connected the underground chamber directly to the furnace hall on the floor above, where the bodies, once removed by Sonderkommando prisoners, could be placed into the muffles without passing through any area visible from outside the building. Each of these details solved a specific problem encountered during the previous months. The freight elevator eliminated the need to carry bodies up staircases, as had been necessary in the old crematorium at Auschwitz I. The false showers reduced resistance during the final minutes before death, which had previously forced guards to push by force people who sensed danger. The underground position of the gas chamber muffled the screams that had once escaped outside. None of this was accidental or improvised. Every element of the building had been corrected in response to operational friction created by the earlier model, through a process of testing and adjustment internally documented by the SS as efficiency improvements, with memoranda discussing processing times and daily capacity, as though they were describing an ordinary production plant. Crematoria IV and V, smaller and more hastily constructed, revealed the limits of that engineering. Their gas chambers were at ground level rather than underground, and their incineration capacity was lower. They were built quickly because by the time they entered service, the number of deportations had already exceeded Bischoff's original calculations. The camp's internal correspondence, filled with figures and deadlines, made no moral distinction between building a barracks and building a crematorium. Everything belonged to the same language of infrastructure management, without any document pausing to name what was actually being manufactured. The full circuit began long before anyone reached those underground doors. It began at the railway ramp Bischoff ordered, built directly inside Birkenau at the beginning of 1944. Until then, the line had ended 1.5 miles away, forcing the deportees to walk or be transported by truck from Auschwitz station. The new internal ramp eliminated that intermediate stage. Trains entered directly into the heart of the camp, between 2 rows of barracks, and stopped only a few meters from the crematoria. The design shortened the time between arrival and death, reduced the possibility of escape during transfer, and concentrated in a single location, controlled by a small number of officers, the decision determining the immediate fate of every person. That decision was called selection, and it lasted only seconds for each deportee. An SS doctor, almost always accompanied by other officers, watched each person step down from the wagon and pointed with one finger to the left or the right, without speaking, without examining documents, and with no visible criterion beyond apparent age and physical condition. Those who appeared capable of forced labor were sent to one side, registered, tattooed, and absorbed into the barracks system. Those who did not, the overwhelming majority of children, almost all the elderly. Mothers who refused to separate from their young children were sent directly toward the crematoria, told that they were going to shower before being settled into the camp. The people responsible for sustaining that lie before the deportees themselves, guiding them into the undressing room, later removing their bodies from the gas chamber and carrying them to the furnaces, were not SS men. They were Jewish prisoners forcibly selected for the Sonderkommando, compelled under threat of immediate death to carry out every stage of the process, from sorting the clothing of those just killed to extracting gold dental work before incineration. The SS kept them isolated from the rest of the camp, periodically replaced them, and in most cases eventually murdered them as well so that no direct witness to the process survived for too long. The design of extermination did not merely produce death on a mass scale. It also produced a mechanism that concealed that death behind hands other than those of the direct executioners. Those sent to the right on the ramp entered a second circuit, different from immediate death but designed according to the same logic of progressive dispossession. They were taken to disinfection barracks, where their heads and all body hair were shaved. They were forced to shower under water that might be freezing or scalding, depending on the whim of the guards on duty, and were issued striped uniforms that rarely fit. A camp official tattooed a number onto the left forearm, replacing from that moment onward every personal name in the official records. For the Auschwitz administration, each person ceased to be an individual with a history and became a figure in a ledger, entered and sooner or later removed with the same accounting coldness. That admission procedure, as meticulous as the gas chamber process itself, served a different, but complementary purpose. It did not kill immediately, but within hours it erased every visible trace of the prisoner's previous identity, leaving only a numbered body available for labor until it no longer produced enough to justify keeping it alive. The design of extermination did not end with death itself. It continued afterward, upon the bodies and everything each person had carried when stepping from the train. Before a corpse entered the furnace room, dentists designated from within the Sonderkommando searched every mouth for gold dental work, which was collected in boxes and later melted into bars in a furnace reserved exclusively for that purpose. The hair of murdered women was cut before gassing or gathered afterward in the attics of the crematoria, untangled, separated from hairpins and ribbons, packed into sacks, and shipped to German textile factories to be turned into industrial felt. The objects each person brought in a suitcase, clothing, shoes, eyeglasses, watches, money, jewelry, were piled in a section of the camp that prisoners themselves called Kanada, because they associated the name with wealth and abundance, in brutal contrast with the hunger they endured only meters away. Hundreds of female prisoners worked entire shifts, sorting those belongings, separating what could be reused from what could not, before the trains that had carried their owners returned to Germany. This time loaded with goods. Not even the ashes escaped this logic of exploitation. During some periods, the SS ordered them mixed with compost used as fertilizer on farms near the camp, including farms worked by prisoners under the same system of agricultural exploitation. When the volume of ash exceeded every possible use, it was dumped directly into pits, depressions in the ground, or carried by truck to the Vistula River, which flowed only a few kilometers from the chimneys. The complete circuit, from selection on the ramp to the final dispersal of the remains, functioned as a chain for extracting value that did not stop even after nothing human remained to exploit except the metal in the teeth and the hair on the head. The system did not depend only on brick, steel, and gas. It also depended on an entire layer of deception designed with the same meticulous care as Bischoff's plans. Since 1940, the inscription Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free, had hung above the entrance arch to Auschwitz I, a phrase Höss copied directly from Dachau, where he had previously served as an officer. He ordered a prisoner blacksmith to forge it in iron, deliberately reversing the letter B so the alteration could be seen from both ends of the road. At Birkenau, the camp orchestra, composed of prisoner musicians forced to play, was ordered to position itself beside the ramp and accompany the arrival of every convoy with marches and waltzes. The people stepping down from the train, still dazed after days without water or food, tried to interpret the music as a sign that the place they had reached could not be as terrible as they feared. Every element of that staging, from the music to the welcoming signs and the false underground showers, served the same purpose as the ventilation system calculated by TOPS engineers. Reduce friction in the process, shorten resistance, keep the machine moving. While Bischoff perfected the machinery of death at Birkenau, another component of the same system was being built only a few kilometers away, this one designed to extract labor until the limit of physical endurance before killing. IG Farben constructed its Buna-Werke complex at Monowitz, using forced labor supplied directly by the camp, under a prisoner rental arrangement in which the SS charged the company for each day of labor, whether the worker lived or died. Those who collapsed during construction from exhaustion or illness were not transferred to a hospital. They were sent back to Birkenau and selected again, this time for the gas chambers. The labor camp and the extermination camp were not separate projects that happened to occupy the same territory. They were two stages of the same calculation. Extract the greatest possible output from every body before destroying it, without wasting time or resources keeping alive anyone who could no longer produce. Every brick in that machinery first passed through the hands of a prisoner. Bischoff's construction office did not have free workers at its disposal. It relied on forced labor detachments, the Baukommandos, composed of men taken from the same barracks whose occupants would later be gassed or worked to total exhaustion. They carried bricks, mixed cement, laid railway tracks, and raised the walls of the very buildings in which gas would later operate, gas some of them would themselves breathe. German civilian companies, including the armaments firm Krupp and the electrical company Siemens, as well as IG Farben, directly benefited from this prisoner rental system, paying the SS for each day of work without a single payment ever reaching the prisoners themselves. Those who collapsed from exhaustion while building received no genuine medical care. They were pulled aside, replaced by the next available man in line, and in most cases ultimately selected for the chambers they had helped construct. The camp was built, literally, at the cost of the lives of its builders, in a cycle that made no distinction between labor being exploited and labor being destroyed. None of this machinery was described for what it truly was in the official correspondence circulating between Auschwitz and Berlin. The documents used Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, to refer to the immediate gassing of people taken from trains without ever entering the camp registry. They used Sonderaktion, special action, for a mass murder operation coordinated in advance. They spoke of resettlement to the east when referring to the deportation of entire Jewish communities to centers that were, in most cases, extermination sites. This vocabulary did not arise from belated moral shame or an attempt to conceal the truth from the writer's own consciences. It was an operational tool, designed so that orders of extreme gravity could circulate by telex, registered mail, and monthly reports, without provoking questions, and without leaving an explicit written record of what was actually being commanded. In his own memoranda, Karl Bischoff referred to the gas chambers of Crematoria 2 and 3 as Sonderkeller, special cellars, and to the complete installations as Vergasungskeller, gassing cellars, in technical language that a reader unfamiliar with the context might mistake for the terminology of an ordinary industrial plant. In that sense, the entire camp was designed not only in brick and steel but also on paper, with a vocabulary constructed to ensure that the machinery could operate without being betrayed by its own name. In November 1943, the SS administration acknowledged in practice the scale the complex had reached by dividing Auschwitz into 3 separately commanded camps. Auschwitz I retained its original function as the main camp and administrative center. Auschwitz II-Birkenau was formally designated the heart of the extermination operation. Auschwitz III Monowitz came to depend more directly on the industrial requirements of IG Farben. Rudolf Höss left his position as commandant that same month and was transferred to Oranienburg, to the Central Inspectorate of Concentration Camps, from where he would continue supervising, from a broader perspective, the logistical coordination of the deportations that 1 year later would turn Birkenau, now under Arthur Liebehenschel's command, into the center of the Hungarian operation. At the beginning of 1944, while Bischoff and Kammler were still calculating how to absorb the coming wave of Hungarian transports, 2 prisoners decided that the only way to stop the machinery was to carry its design beyond the barbed wire. Rudolf Höss and Alfred Wetzler, both Slovak, had spent months memorizing transport figures, the exact locations of the gas chambers, furnace capacities, guard routines, and shift schedules, drawing on information circulating between different labor details, including the Sonderkommando itself. On the 7th of April 1944, they escaped by hiding inside a stack of timber covered with tobacco soaked in gasoline to confuse the dogs. They remained motionless for 3 days until the search operation inside the perimeter ended, then walked for almost 2 weeks before crossing the border into Slovakia. Once safe, they dictated a detailed document now known as the Vrba-Wetzler Report. Maps of the camp's internal layout, precise descriptions of selection on the ramp, the false showers, the operation of the furnaces, and an explicit warning that the SS was preparing the infrastructure to receive and exterminate the entire Jewish community of Hungary, almost 1 million people within a matter of weeks. The document reached Jewish organizations, Allied representatives, and the Holy See before the mass deportations from Hungary began in May, yet it did not stop them or significantly slow their pace. The design Bischoff had perfected over 2 years was by then more difficult to dismantle than to describe. Vrba and Wetzler's escape proved that the mechanism could be known in exact detail from outside, but not that it could be stopped from outside in time. The complete system reached maximum capacity precisely when it was most needed. In May 1944, the SS and the Hungarian government coordinated the mass deportation of Hungary's Jews, the last major Jewish community in Europe that until then had remained relatively untouched by systematic deportation. Between May and July, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews arrived at Birkenau in only 8 weeks, transported in convoys that reached the newly constructed ramp almost every day. All 4 crematoria operated simultaneously, day and night, and even then their capacity proved insufficient. The SS reopened open-air cremation pits beside Crematorium V, the same improvised solution used in 1942, now applied on a scale neither Bischoff nor Kammler had anticipated in their original plans. The figures documented by the camp administration itself in registry books, transport lists, and internal correspondence of the construction office make it possible today to reconstruct a death toll of approximately 1.1 million people at Auschwitz-Birkenau between 1940 and 1945. The overwhelming majority were Jews from nearly every country occupied by Germany, alongside thousands of Polish prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma, and other groups persecuted by the regime. No other point in the Nazi camp system reached that volume. No other site was redesigned so many times, with such attention to technical detail, and so much accompanying commercial correspondence, in order to sustain that rate continuously for months. The railway wagons feeding this circuit did not come only from Hungary or territories near Poland. They traveled distances difficult to imagine today within a single freight train route. From Thessaloniki, at the southern edge of Greece, to Amsterdam, more than 2,000 kilometers away. From Rome and Paris, from the German-occupied Channel Islands, from Jewish communities in Slovakia, Belgium, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. Each train took between 3 and 8 days to complete the journey, carrying 80 people in each cattle car without toilets, water, or ventilation, under conditions that killed some of the deportees before the convoy even reached the ramp. The railway network crossing German-occupied Europe ultimately converged on a single junction designed to receive it. The same intersection of tracks that in 1940 had merely been one of the reasons the SS selected that abandoned Polish army barracks for the first camp. The administration's own internal calculations, later included among the charges discussed with Höss during post-war interrogations, give some idea of the scale at which the system operated once completed. Crematoria 2 and Turai 2, the largest, each contained 5 ovens with 3 muffles, together capable of incinerating approximately 2,000 bodies per day. The limit was imposed not by the availability of victims but by the risk that the refractory brick inside the combustion chambers would crack from overheating. Crematoria IV and V, smaller and more poorly constructed, could, according to Topfundsöhne's estimates, incinerate around 1,500 bodies per day each, although wartime shortages forced their final dimensions below the original plan. On the busiest days during the summer of 1944, the 4 installations combined approached a total capacity of 5,000 bodies in 24 hours. A figure recorded by the SS bureaucracy with the same numerical coldness it would have used to describe the output of a munitions plant. Some members of the Sonderkommando, aware that their periodic replacement almost always ended in the gas chamber, decided to leave written records of what they saw before the SS eliminated them as well. They rolled sheets of paper inside glass bottles or metal containers and buried them near the crematoria in the soil they walked over every day during forced labor shifts. One of those texts, written by a prisoner named Zalman Gradowski, described in detail the entire process of the undressing room and gas chamber, and ended with a request addressed to whoever might one day find those pages. Read them, preserve them. Do not allow the history of what happened there to disappear together with those who lived through it. Gradowski died only days later during the revolt he had helped organize within the special unit. His manuscripts, together with those of other prisoners who did the same, were discovered buried at different points around the grounds during the decades after liberation, becoming the only direct voices surviving from the men forced to operate from within the machinery Bischoff had designed so that no one would ever be able to describe it from that perspective. On the 7th of October 1944, a group of Sonderkommando prisoners assigned to Crematorium 4 learned that they were about to be liquidated, as had happened before to other groups removed from the process. Using explosives that Jewish women forced to work at a nearby armaments factory had smuggled out week after week in quantities too small to be detected in departure checks, the prisoners revolted, killed 3 guards, and blew up the building that had turned them into instruments of extermination. It was the only direct attack against the physical machinery of the camp in its entire history, and also the briefest. The SS crushed the revolt within hours and executed nearly everyone who had taken part. The women who had smuggled the explosives were publicly hanged at the beginning of January 1945 before the remaining prisoners, as a final warning before the camp itself ceased to exist. At the beginning of November 1944, with the Red Army drawing closer and most of Europe's Jewish communities already deported or destroyed, the SS suspended the gassing of new arrivals. On November 25, Himmler personally ordered the dismantling of the installations he had spent nearly 3 years driving to ever greater scale. It was not an act of remorse. It was an attempt to destroy evidence before Soviet troops could document it, as had already happened months earlier at Majdanek, which had been liberated almost intact and immediately used as photographic proof of extermination. Following the order, prisoners forced by the SS under the eyes of their own killers dynamited crematoria 2 and 3, dismantled part of the Topfunzerne machinery piece by piece, and set fire to the warehouses known internally as Canada, where for years the possessions confiscated from every arriving convoy had been piled. Between January 17 and 21, 1945, with Soviet artillery already audible in the distance, the SS evacuated approximately 56,000 prisoners on foot toward the interior of the Reich. The columns advanced along frozen roads with insufficient food, guarded by armed men who shot anyone who stopped or fell. Thousands died along the route in what survivors and witnesses would soon begin calling the death marches. When Soviet troops finally entered the complex on the 27th of January 1945, they found only around 7,000 prisoners alive, too weak or ill to have been included in the evacuation, together with the dynamited remains of the crematoria and mountains of objects the SS had not managed to destroy or carry away. Shoes, eyeglasses, cut hair, and suitcases bearing names and addresses written by hand by people who believed, until the final stage of the train journey, that they were going to settle somewhere. When the Red Army finally entered Birkenau, it found less a functioning factory than the deliberately calculated ruins of one. Crematoria 2 and 3 were craters of twisted brick, dynamited on the orders of a man who only a year earlier had demanded the exact opposite: speed, capacity, continuity. The tracks of the internal ramp, built only months before to eliminate seconds between arrival and death, ended beneath the snow of the war's final winter with no trains left to travel over them. Inside the Canada warehouses, the SS had failed to burn completely. Soviet soldiers found acres of shoes, eyeglasses, toothbrushes, prosthetic limbs, and suitcases bearing family addresses written by hand, arranged according to the same logic of efficiency that governed everything else in the complex. Nothing they saw required further explanation. The arrangement of the space itself, calculated over years to produce death at the lowest possible cost, was the clearest evidence of what had happened there. Rudolf Höss escaped at the end of the war under a false identity, working as a farm laborer under the name Franz Lang in northern Germany. British troops located and arrested him on the 11th of March 1946. Months later, he testified at the Nuremberg trials not as a principal defendant but as a witness, describing before the tribunal the operation of the system he had helped design with the same technical precision he used in his internal memoranda of 1,942. Capacity figures, processing times, names of suppliers. The Allies later handed him over to the Polish authorities because the land on which the camp had been built belonged to Poland, and it was there that he was ultimately tried for what he had done within its geographical boundaries. While awaiting sentence in a cell at Krakow prison, Höss wrote in pencil, at the request of his captors, a detailed account of his administration of the camp. The text contained not a single apology. With the same administrative tone as before, he described the technical difficulties of the first crematoria, tensions with other SS officers, and the constant pressure created by train schedules that brought deportees before the camp had enough capacity to process them. The victims appeared in those pages as figures and logistical problems, almost never as human beings. It was the same language he had used for years with Bischoff, with Kammler, and with the engineers of Topfunzerne, the language of a man who had built a factory and, once captured, knew only how to account for its operation. The Supreme National Tribunal of Poland sentenced him to death on the 2nd of April 1947. The execution was scheduled to take place at the camp itself, in the inner courtyard of Auschwitz I, only a few meters from the first crematorium he had ordered adapted in 1941, and from the house where he had lived with his wife and 5 children during the years in which, from that same domestic proximity, he administered the largest extermination mechanism ever constructed. On the 16th of April 1947, before a small group of witnesses, including former prisoners of the camp, Höss climbed the gallows without speaking. The structure he had designed, expanded, and perfected for almost 4 years so that death would be invisible, silent, and efficient became the final visible setting of his own, carried out before those who had survived to witness it.